I am absolutely thrilled that Ben Barry is here with us today to speak about masculinity and the body. You know, we've had so much focus on women's bodies for this, and, you know, with Just Cause, a lot of these issues are faced predominantly by women, but this is not something that's exclusively about women. And so I'm so excited to hear what you have to say. I want to get your title right because I think it's so impressive. Ben, he's down here from Ryerson University up in Canada, and he's the director of the Center for Fashion Diversity and Social Change. So please join me in welcoming him for his talk called Fabulous Masculinities, Refashioning the Male Body.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited and honored to be here and thrilled to close out today. I'm really excited and inspired by the conversations we've had. I feel really hopeful and optimistic for the incredible changes that are happening, both in fashion studies and also within the fashion industry. And I hope today that I can really draw together some of the conversations we've had through the context of masculinities. For my talk today, I'm going to be drawing on a 3-year research project that I had the opportunity to lead called Refashioning Masculinity. And this project explored how men experience, how they navigate, how they reimagine masculinity through their everyday dress practices. Now, this project centered 50 diverse men between the ages of 22 and 78. They reflected various sexualities, social classes, occupations, races, and body types. And they participated in the project in 2 main ways. The first way was through a series of wardrobe interviews. So we went into their homes and they provided a tour of their closets, talking about the uses, the memories, the feelings that they attached to their various garments. The second part of the project was a fashion show. So we turned the university gym into a runway, and the men actually participated in a fashion show, modeling their own clothes so we could understand how they embodied their clothing. What really inspired this project was this incredible change, this trifecta of transformation in menswear over the past 2 decades. And it began first with a change in the silhouette, this skinny, slim-fit silhouette that was first introduced on the runway by Hedi Slimane when he launched Dior in 2001. Now, this was parallel with the new fashionable male body, a long, lean, very slim, adolescent, and white male body who modeled this new slim-fit silhouette. Now, this went from one runway to runways all over the world to fast fashion that's really become the mainstay in menswear. Now, the third transformation which occurred was the movement from the fashion industry's representation of men in magazines, on the runway, to men's self-representation on social media. So men actively performed and constructed their identities by uploading images of themselves, wearing clothes, showcasing their bodies. Now, at the center of these 3 changes has been the male body. In fact, the male body has been central in reinventing and redefining menswear over the past 2 decades. Now, of course, men's fashion has shifted over time. The idea of the fashionable male body has shifted over time. Transformations in menswear, though, have been historically slower and fewer than those related to women's wear. But nevertheless, as you can see from the slides above, there has been a change. So if we look in the 1940s and 50s, we see sort of a boxy cut, drab mass conformity that really de-emphasized the male body. In the 60s and 70s, we moved to the Peacock Revolution, and we see a much more close-fitted silhouette showcasing the body, and with that, a new body ideal, a slimmer, younger ideal, very much of a precursor to what we saw with Hedi Slimane. And if we move to the 80s and 90s, we see sort of big suits and big bodies. So what we see is some masculine archetypes represented in menswear, captains of industry with big shouldered suits, and we also see big, hard, muscular, young and white bodies represented. Now, fashion has a very interesting and a tense relationship when it comes to masculinity. If we think of the most culturally dominant notion of masculinity, this is what we call hegemonic masculinity. These are the ideals of masculinity that are the most valued within a society. So if we think in the West, masculinity then, hegemonic masculinity, is about power, is about reason, and is about the rejection of femininity. And so recently, since the 18th century, masculinity has been defined in opposition to femininity, in opposition to fashion, in opposition to the body. And so we see in menswear primarily dark colors, heavier materials. And in the same way, hegemonic masculinity is defined in opposition to the body. So the notion of the body, the notion of embodiment implies a sense of vulnerability and the potential for sensuality. And both of these are marked as feminine within our Western gender system. And so simply playing with fashion comes with significant risks for men. Many of them face violent attacks, they're chased down the street, because fashion challenges hegemonic masculinity. And I've selected this image. This is from a 1991 collection from Jean-Paul Gaultier, and it's on exhibition right here at the Fashion and Physique exhibit. And I've selected this because I think it really shows the vulnerability of hegemonic masculinity in relation to fashion and the body. We have this hard, muscular torso reflected in the sweater, right? It epitomizes this power and dominance of hegemonic masculinity. But if you look at the sweater, it's also cozy. It protects and encloses the wearer. And I think in many ways, this shows that hegemonic masculinity is this strong outward performance, but inside, it's full of fear. Hegemonic masculinity is always at risk of being found as defective, in many ways challenging men's supposed natural power and the supposed dominance of masculinity. So thinking about this oppositional relationship between masculinity and fashion in the body, one of the things I want to ask are, what are the consequences of these three transformations over the past 2 decades in menswear on men, the body, and masculinity? And there's 2 ways to really think about this. The first way is that some scholars will argue that in fact hegemonic masculinity has been destabilized. We have this shift from a muscular hard body to a leaner, more feminized body. We also have a sartorial shift from clothes that were quite conservative, that upheld masculine archetypes, to really this diversity in menswear that celebrates femininity, celebrates androgyny, celebrates gender play. And so what this has done is this has produced new visibilities for men who were previously marginalized. So men who are slim, men who are young, men who presented as androgynous or feminine through fashion. They could see themselves, they could see bodies like their own on the runway. And so because they saw this in the fashion industry, masculine identity no longer was based on the sole rejection of femininity. And there were a greater plurality of behaviors that were incorporated into masculine identity. But what I'd like to suggest is, in fact, something more insidious is going on. And I don't think hegemonic masculinity has been destabilized. Right, if we look at the collections, especially over the last decade, we certainly see a greater range of gender presentation and expression through clothing. But we see these still modeled on one type of body, a thin, young, tall, primarily white body. And so this expansion of the fashionable male body from muscular to lean hasn't destabilized hegemonic masculinity, but instead it's appropriated this lean, thin ideal as a new fashionable male body ideal. And so in men's fashion now, 2 body ideals exist and are glorified: the muscular man and the boyish waif. And certainly hard muscular bodies are still very present. If we look at underwear advertising, commercial fashion advertising, with the advent of the spornosexual that Mark Simpson has written about in 2014, hard bodies are still there. And so now we have these 2 ideals glorified. And certainly what I found in the majority of the men I spoke to in Refashioning Masculinity was that men who conformed to one of these 2 ideals could easily find clothes that fit their bodies when they went into clothing stores. They took pride and they took pleasure in photographing their bodies and their clothing and uploading these on social media. But for most men who did not conform to one of these 2 ideals, they didn't enjoy the same privileges. And so certainly for thin, young, white, feminine-presenting men, they finally could feel expressed and body confident through fashion. But this new ideal further marginalizes fat, disabled, older men. So I think femininity and gender play through fashion can be an amazing source of liberation and freedom, but right now it's only finding expression on limited body ideals. Of course, marginalized people have long used clothing to challenge dominant discourses in fashion and in culture more broadly. In his forthcoming book, Fabulous, Madison Moore charts the histories of Black, queer, brown people who have long used self-presentation to resist normative ideas around identity. And he says that they do this through this practice called fabulousness. And he writes, as a confrontational form of self-presentation, fabulousness is a practice of everyday life that Black, queer, and other people forced to the margins have used to protect some form of anonymity in their day-to-day experience. And certainly we see this throughout history, whether it's in ballroom culture and drag queens that Madison writes about. Fabulousness is a way that people who have been pushed to the margins by fashion and by culture have used clothing, have hacked with clothing as a way to push back. And I think the reach of fabulousness has only expanded in the digital age. Minha Pham uses the term networked vanity to talk about the importance of outfit posts by marginalized people. And she claims that outfit posts, network vanity, allows marginalized groups to claim representation by representing themselves on social media. And so I think we could think there's almost this networked fabulousness that's existing. So I'd like to draw from Moore and from Pham today, and I'd like to center the experiences of 3 men in my research. I want to move away from this dominant discourse of how fashion simply marginalizes non-normative, unruly bodies. And instead, I want to center the vitality and the creativity of non-normative or supposedly unruly bodies through their everyday dress practices. Now, these men are certainly the outliners in my research, but they're challenging. They're talking back to fashion through their everyday dress practices. What I'm going to argue is that these men practice what I'll call fabulous masculinities. So they're wearing, they're styling, they're photographing, they're hacking clothes in ways that create a new relationship between gender and the dressed body. The first man I'd like to introduce you to is Nathan, who's 33 years old. He's white, he's gay, he's a writer. He uses a motorized wheelchair and has limited mobility. Now, Nathan is very aware that disabled bodies are invisible in culture, and particularly in fashion culture. He also is aware that when disability is represented, it's portrayed through a series of stereotypes. Often disabled men are shown to lack agency, to be weak, and he seeks to challenge this by wearing vibrant, colorful clothes. So he's not simply trying to wear clothing that shows his allegiance with hegemonic masculinity, but instead through vibrant, bold colors. And talking about his colorful wardrobe, he says, color expresses that I like to play, I like to be bold, I like to be goofy. If disabled people are wearing bland, boring brown stuff that their attendant clearly picked out for them, it doesn't pop. This is agency over my body with these colors. I'm wearing this color, and I'm owning what I'm wearing. Now, he also uses color to challenge how viewers typically think of the disabled body and how they look at aspects of his bodies that they might think are disabled. So he specifically wears colorful pants and colorful trainers. And he says, I know everybody's afraid of the lower half of my body because they're like, oh my God, that's the part that must be paralyzed. They're all scared to go there. So I'll wear purple shoes so that people notice my lower half. Now, Nathan is also very aware that disabled people are infrequently represented as sexualized beings in the world, and he certainly wants to challenge this. I think if we look at the representation of men, we've seen that whether it's muscular bodies or lean bodies, men are hypersexualized in fashion media. So Nathan wants to talk back to this by wearing garments and accessories that specifically sexualize his body. And so talking about this harness that he wears, he says, I don't feel that many times that my body has value because I constantly have to push to be sexualized, push to be objectified, push to be noticed in the club. And then specifically talking about queer culture, he continues. He says, and then when I do bring a guy home, then what happens is he says, oh, I didn't realize you were that disabled. All these moments, all these microaggressions constantly prove that my body doesn't have value. But I want to challenge that and show a disabled body is desirable. And so he does that through the clothes he wears, and he also does that through his social media images. And so he constantly will post images of himself on dating apps, on hookup apps, of him in sexualized, objectified poses, but he makes it very clear he's in a wheelchair. He wants to show viewers that a disabled body is a desirable body. The next man I want to introduce you to is Trevor, who's 31, he's trans, he's white, and he's a photographer. Now, he's self-identified as fat, and he loves to wear clothing that challenges the gender binary, masculinity, and the body. And he particularly enjoys hacking up his clothing. So this is a sweater he bought at a secondhand store. It was a Hooters sweater, and on the front it said Hooters. On the back it said, more than a mouthful. And he thought this would be playful to wear because he recently had top surgery. But he also really wanted to wear this because he thought this challenged the idea of what bodies can wear crop tops. When he decided to hack this up, he took it home, he hacked off the bottom, turned it into a crop top. He said, "Big guys in crop tops is a big fuck you to the world. I'm the least intentional person to wear this. Like, this clothing item is meant for everyone else except me. I'm not a sexy woman, I don't have a tiny stomach, I'm not showing off my abs." And so he's challenging viewers when he wears this to think, what bodies do we idealize, and in what types of clothing? Now, Trevor further tries to challenge this ideal of thinness through other garments that he wears, such as this t-shirt. Now, in 2009, Kate Moss claimed that she lived by this motto: nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. Now, this was highly critiqued by the press as encouraging eating disorders, but nevertheless, we see this ultra-thin body glorified in fashion for women, but as we've seen, increasingly now for men. And so Trevor tries to challenge this directly through this t-shirt that has the quote on it with this fun graphic saying nutrition facts and calorie zero. And wearing this, when he bought it, he thought, I just love the idea of having to buy this in a 2X and having to run around in my fat body with a shirt that said, nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. So wearing this, he's deliberately challenging this idealization of thinness in fashion. And he also does this on his social media. Rather than posting completely flattering photos of himself, instead what he does is he posts photos of him shoving food in his face and looking like an excited kid about it. He wants to again center fatness, center food, center his loves and his body on social media, rather than try to mimic an ideal. The last man I'd like to introduce you to today is Ulu. Ulu's 38, he's black, he's gay, he's an actor. And he self-identifies as embodying these two oppositions. On one hand, he's tall and he's fat. On the other hand, he's feminine presenting. Now, rather than trying to downplay these oppositions, he chooses to exaggerate them through his clothes. So talking about his wardrobe, he says, I have clothes with a big shoulder, a big sleeve, wide pants legs. It's not just look at me. It's look at me. Look at how much space I take up. Look how tall I am. Look how broad my shoulders are. Look how bright I'm sparkling in the lights. And he not only does this through his clothes on his body, but specifically on his body in motion. He's very aware of how clothes move on his body and how he moves on clothes that can exaggerate his size and his femininity. So speaking of this, one of his favorite coats, this floor-length leopard print coat, he says what he loves about this coat is that it's gathered so much that if he turns around, it's like a firework going off. He's like, usually I talk with my hands, but this makes me want to snap it and throw it in the air and turn around and face you. And it's perfect for making an entrance. It's got snaps here, and he gestures to the front. So it's perfect for coming in and then undoing and revealing something underneath. So one of his favorite coats, but again, how clothes move on his body allows him to emphasize his size and his femininity. He also loves clothes that challenge gendered associations between materials and the body, and specifically the reveal aspects of the body through unexpected materials. And so this is one of his favorite shirts. It has a deep V with sequins all around it. And wearing this, he says, there's a fun juxtaposition with my hairy chest and sequins. Often, either it's a woman wearing sequins or a gay man who shaves his chest wearing sequins. It's usually, again, smooth, smooth skin. But with me, I don't shave, so the hair comes out through the sequins. So I think, again, he's revealing aspects of his body through this material that challenges our gendered expectations and assumptions. Now, although these men are marginalized by hegemonic masculinity, they all recognize they have a degree of gender privilege when they engage with fashion. They recognize that men do not have the same cultural expectations to manage their appearance. During my interview with Nathan, he commented, "Because I need help to dress and undress, I can't call my attendant and be like, I feel like wearing this today. Can you help me and change this outfit for me? It doesn't work that way because these attendants that take care of me, they're doing other bookings. I don't know if I could be a female-identified person and have to do the setup and makeup and changing." So he's recognizing these different expectations and cultural norms when it comes to appearance. And Trevor realized the same thing. He recognizes the difference when he was a fat-identified woman versus a fat-identified man. He commented, "I'm considered less fat at the same size as a dude than when I was a woman. Being a chubby dude is a thing that exists in the world. People don't have a huge issue with it and don't expect me to be vain or body conscious anyway." So there's an allowance for men to be chubby. And during our interview, he further commented about this fad of the dad bod and about bear culture in the gay community that provided this allowance for him to be fat. And I think similarly for Ulu, yes, he takes up space through his clothing, but men are encouraged to take up space, where women are encouraged to diet, to slim down, to take up less space. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that these men do not experience anxiety and alienation from the fashion industry. They most certainly do. They face daily anxiety and alienation. They had trouble finding clothes that fit their bodies. They had trouble with the cost of clothing, and fashion was almost inaccessible to them. But nevertheless, these men intervened in the fashion industry to make clothing work for them. And with that, they shared amazing ideas of how the fashion industry can do things differently. So Nathan questioned why designers don't use a wheelchair in their design process. Why don't they make the wheelchair a fashion piece? During our interview, he said, "Why don't you use the chair as a fashion piece? Why can't the guy in a wheelchair use what he's got already? I'm really obsessed with this idea of cuffs that I can put around my arm. But I can also put them around my chair. Tim Gunn would have a field day." Tim Gunn, if you read this, call me. And so I'll make sure that Tim gets this message at the end of today. So because these men are directly intervening in the fashion system, making clothing work for them, they not only have great ideas about how clothing can work for their bodies, they have great ideas of how clothing can work for bodies like their own. And I think what they're really suggesting to me is that we need to change our design process. We need to move to a design process that centers the experiences and the knowledges of wearers. So we need to move from this hierarchical structure of a singular all-knowing designer to a flat structure where we actually design with wearers, a design process called Codesign. So then the people who wear garments help determine how they're designed. And this really shifts power in fashion because it values the knowledges and lived experiences of wearers. I'd like to conclude with this. I think as part of co-design, we really need to challenge our own assumptions. And in Canada, where I'm from, we're going through a process of reconciliation with Indigenous people because of the destructive history of colonization and the continued destructiveness of colonization. And as a non-Indigenous person, I've been learning a lot from Indigenous knowledges. And so I'd like to provide a verbal citation. I'm sharing a conversation with permission from February 9th, 2018, with Mona Stonefish, who is an Anishinaabe elder and the knowledge keeper for the Bodies in Translation Project. And Mona was talking about the perception of disabilities in Western society. And this is what she said. She said, "In Indigenous society, we do not see people for what they lack. We see people for what they have." I think one of the central themes that we've learned today is that fashion often is designed, is promoted to disguise, to hide what people supposedly lack so they resemble the ideal a little bit more. But what if fashion practice actually celebrated what people have? I think the men who practice fabulous masculinities are celebrating what their bodies have through clothing. And I think through fashion co-design, we're able to challenge our own assumptions about bodies and dominant Western perspectives about them, and we can center the needs and the fashion passions of diverse bodies to make clothes that celebrate all of our bodies uniquely for what they have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Does anyone have any questions for Ben? Come up to the front. I'll start off with a question. I just was hoping you could maybe say a bit about the Center for Diversity and Social Change in Fashion that you're running and sort of how this fits in with your work up there.
Yeah. So I'm from the School of Fashion at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. And one of the goals of our school is to create a fashion system that includes all bodies and all people. So both who's designing the clothes and also who clothes are accessible for, and fashion media as well. And so the center is really a hub to bring that together. So to bring research, to promote events and workshops that all aim to create an inclusive and diverse fashion industry.
Hi. So this is a question that came out also of the other from the other speaker presentation. I was curious to what extent this pressure towards conforming to an ideal body is also, and versus, you know, embodying your unique circumstances, really embedded in fashion, parts of its history, especially its history of ready-to-wear industry, standardization, kind of uniformity of sizes. So it's almost something that fashion has to work against.
So I think the industry, I think if I understand your question, it's sort of how can we challenge these normative ideas or these systems?
Right, but how much are they embedded in really the way that we buy clothes in terms of sizing? You know, they're pre-sized, you know, we have a ready-to-wear industry since...
Yeah, I mean, certainly these norms are embedded as we learn through, and through these systems, right? Modeling agencies, design practices, production, retail. We just think about how fashion, the retail of fashion is so gendered. Fashion weeks are gendered, magazines are gendered. But I also want to add that fashion education is part of that system. And I think it's really important to think about how do we teach the next generation to design an inclusive industry. What are we teaching in terms of design practices, in terms of sizing, in terms of media, in terms of retail? Because I think that is one of the most important ways to actually create cultural and system transformation. So certainly this is all connected, but I'd like to add the fashion education as an important player in that system that can facilitate change. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I thought it was fascinating, particularly the concepts that you touched on the two ideal male figures, instead of being more of inclusion as we're seeing. I also agree that we're seeing two completely separate ideals being pushed. And nowadays, with like, you know, current issues socially, the rise of like extreme right movement, and I think there's a big conversation about toxic masculinity going around. I think there is a body or a type of male figure that is currently non-existent. In the rise of feminine masculinity, there's a part of masculinity that is so abhorred by it that they are actually going to an extreme where anything feminine has to be shut down. And there's maybe, I think, maybe a pushback against the masculine, which is actually exaggerating a fear on this far-right view. What are your thoughts on this toxic masculinity we're seeing, where views for men are so feminine that it's pushing that view away?
I mean, toxic masculinity is ever present. I think it's interesting. The three men I presented on, right, are all marginalized from toxic masculinity or hegemonic masculinity, right? They're queer, they're trans, they're disabled. They already are marginalized from that definition, which gives them, I think, some room to play because they never fit that ideal to begin with. But I think for men that did conform or did try to conform much more to the norm, even talking about fashion, even participating in this research was very scary. And in fact, we didn't have to call this research, we couldn't call this research, fashion research. It was research on clothing, to immediately try to use a word that wasn't as gendered and wasn't as feminine.
So extremely sensitive. It's so sensitive.
It's a very sensitive topic, and it certainly pushes on this fear of what does femininity mean? If I express that, what does that mean? And I think many ways it challenges, right, this supposed hierarchy of hegemonic masculinity and the supposed supremacy and naturalness of men's power. And I think that's really what's at the root of this, and particularly for certain men who embody that power in society.
Hi, actually kind of playing off of the idea of hegemonic masculinity. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about modern dandyism or teddy boys and the idea of a masculinity that also embraces the idea of fashionability when the idea of being fashionable is so strongly linked with femininity.
Well, I think it's really interesting when we look at how fashion markets to men, and we look at how certain groups of men, especially dominant groups of men, take up fashion. Because often fashion becomes recoded as masculine. So if you see hair dye, for instance, promoted to men, it's called color camo. Or if we look at the language used in advertising for men, it's often, right, to make you more successful in your career, to make you appear stronger. So a lot of fashion then becomes recoded using masculine discourses. And so one way then for men to play is often then through the suit. So you see suits that can be skinny, you can see colorful socks poking out through your suit, you can see a colorful pocket square, and that for many men is scary, is fearful, is feminine. But they're still protected by wearing, right, this suit, this very idealized notion of white, middle-class European masculinity. So I think it's interesting to really look at the nuances when men play with fashion. How is fashion and anything feminine about fashion recoded as masculine?
Thank you.